It's time to do the talk. Let me get everything set up real quick and we'll talk.
Henry's made a lady out of Lizzie. Chug, 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 chug.
Well, this is probably going to be a lengthy video. You can see I've got myself a script. And for those of you that are just interested in certain aspects of the video, I am going to divide this into chapters where you can skip at your like. We'll be covering my story, how I found the car and what attracted me to the car, why I chose this car, the story of the car itself, as far as I can trace it back, pros and cons about the car, things that make it good for daily driving, things that suck at daily driving, and of course what I had to do to bring it to its current shape. Well, as you know, I've been fascinated by old technology pretty much as far back as I can remember. Old cars were, well, always something that was cool to look at, old car meetings, stuff like that. But a car itself is quite a commitment. And I never really dug into the topic too deep. I read old car magazines, but before I met Paul, for example, I hadn't done rarely anything to a car other than an oil change, tire change, stuff like that. So I literally had no idea. Then came the time where I made my driver's license. Everybody got a car, and so the wish arose in me to own a car as well. Of course, it had to be an old one, because I don't like when the car beeps at me, I haven't put my seatbelt on, I have to abide the laws of the street, things like that. I like when a car is simple, dumb and stupid. So when reading into old car magazines, there is always two topics that seem to be the main criteria, and number one is money and number two is rust. You see, most of the cars of the 60s, 70s have big problems with corroding into nothing after, well, one rain, because they have double sheet metal and cavities in them. The steel quality was sometimes poor, and therefore they're just not that structurally sound after 50, 60 years. The second problem is always parts availability. Most often, if a car is cheap to buy, then it's not going to be cheap to maintain because the spare parts are scarce and, they might be unreliable and such. So, yeah, I slowly dug into the topic of pre-war cars. Pre-war cars in Germany are quite a tough topic. You see, in Germany there was a very high tax for everything above 1 liter of displacement, and therefore most cars around were either very slow, very poorly powered, 2-stroke, 20 horsepower, something like that. And the other section of cars were those for the ultra-rich. And, they're basically unbuyable today. They're so expensive, like, a Mercedes 550k or a Maybach. They're just out of my reach. And, America was pretty far ahead at the time. This car has 3.5 liters of displacement. And so I started to look into other countries. I always had in mind that, a car had to be reliable, and I wanted to have one where you could get spare parts for. So the Model T, for example, was built 15 million times. There are quite a lot of them around. They're achievable. And they're simple as a brick, and you can buy any part brand new right now. But the further I dug into the topic, well, I noticed that it only had one brake in the transmission. And one brake in the transmission means no brake when everything or anything between the transmission and the rear wheels fails. means no brake when you're in neutral, and it means brakes at the rears only, which are always the ones that skid first. So I looked at the successor, the Model A, was still built 4 million times, lots of spare parts available, has double the horsepower, and it has 4-wheel brakes. They're mechanical, but you know, that's a hell of a step forward. So, well, there still was the problem of, you know, money and safety nonetheless, because this car has no crumple zones and no airbag. Factory-wise, it doesn't even have seat belts, safety glass, things like that. And you're still able to achieve 100 kilometers an hour with this thing. So I had to know, apart from, you know, subjective opinions on the topic, where everybody was able to say, "Ah, it's the best car ever, I drive it daily," up to "it's a death trap, don't even think about it, it's just not worth the hassle," and so on. I had to find a way to, for myself, make sure that I was comfortable with driving one of these before buying one. And so I put the dream aside. There's just no one around in Germany to, you know, ask. And I didn't know anybody with an old car at the time. I didn't even have any experience of driving anything older than our 2006 family wagon, a Ford Focus. I mean, yes, it doesn't have heated seats and it doesn't have an automatic parking pilot aid, but it still has ABS and it still has ESP and it's front-wheel drive and it has large tires and, you know, hydraulic brakes, servo steering, all the aids you can think of. So, yeah, I just left it at that. A couple of years later, I met a guy called Paul. He's got a YouTube channel called Horsepower Dashcam. He daily drives a VW Beetle, and his footage was able to show me that it's not that hard. We got in touch. He kindly let me drive his car.
Oh, das war der erste. Entschuldigung. Boah, das tut mir jetzt leid, sorry. Money shift.
And a little later, an even older car, which was a Borgward Isabella.
Also die Leute heutzutage. Woo!
Ja, da habe ich schon gedacht, ui, da.
We made a video on that too. And, well, that gave me confidence because it was something different than your modern day car. But it was doable, completely doable. So, you know, I went online on YouTube and found a guy who owned a Model A not too far away from me. And I just wrote him. And he was kind enough to let me drive his car too.
Oh, ich fahr viel zu schnell.
Langsam.
And, you know, it was another step upwards from the Borgward and the VW, but still not too terrible. After that, I reactivated my online searches about, you know, Model A Fords and found one 20 kilometers from home for a price in the lower mid-range for a drivable, decent-shaped car. And so I went there and I bought it. And that's how this car got into my possession. So what's the story of the car itself? Well, I did, of course, some search online through the VIN number, and what I found out that in 2014 this car was sold from the USA via Barrett-Jackson, which is an auction house in America. It comes from Arizona, and it landed in the Netherlands. It was sold for $17,000 and something in the USA from a company called High Speed Customs. And I contacted them, unfortunately with no result. But in the Netherlands, it sold for 34,500 euros, which I would have never bought. You know, I mean, it looked pretty damn good at those pictures, but that's just, even for Europe, that's a ridiculous price for a Model A to pay. 1 year later, it ends up in Mettmann, our neighbor city, for 20,000. So naturally, I asked the seller what was about that. And the story he told me is that a Chinese person bought the car for his personal collection in China, and mid-transit he noticed, oh damn, the import conditions for old cars are pretty hard for China. So he abandoned ship, gave the car to the seller in Mettmann, and told him to get rid of it. Well, nice story, but here's what I'm thinking. You see, something that I didn't notice while I inspected the car at the seller is that the car has a crack in the frame. It's nothing critical, it's where the bumper meets the frame, it's nothing structural, but there's a crack underneath, and the fenders don't quite match up. Also, if you take a look at the pictures from the Netherlands, then the fender bracket bolts are shiny, and mine are black. And the fenders, at least on this side, have an extra hole drilled into it where the headlight bar is mounted. So what I'm thinking is that probably the Chinese bought it, all right, but in transit the car got damaged. You know, these car transporters where the cars are stacked up like that, maybe it slipped, something like that, and that caused the crack in the frame, that caused the fenders to shift backwards, and all that jazz. It was taken apart, fixed up, a third got crossed off the selling price, and that's how it ended up in Mettmann. Now, the car still drives straight, it brakes fine, it runs like a champ. It's basically a new car. From what I found on the original tires, they were from the 1990s, so I suspect it's been restored right there. Over the last 6 years, it's accumulated a total of 2 miles, and in the 30 years before that, it had gotten no more than 4,000 miles. So it's a rather fresh car, and that's what made me buy it, even though 20k, especially for an American, is quite much for a Model A. You can easily spend that on spare parts when you buy a barn find or something like that and try to fix it up yourself. Again, I have no idea about how to fix up or restore a car, so I wanted something working, and hopefully the troubles slowly start to develop. You know, small things like the horn won't work or a wheel bearing gets shot, something like that, and not just a catastrophic engine failure right off the bat, so that I can slowly get used to wrenching on cars. So, after 6 years of basically standing still, a couple of things, of course, had to be done to the car. I negotiated with the seller to include fresh tires, fixing the vinyl roof which had shrunk, and a full registration TÜV, which is the MOT in Germany, and a couple of minor touch-ups into the selling price, which he did. And over the last month, I dealt with, well, pretty much everything else that bugged me. First up, of course, was lubrication. Every Zerk hadn't been touched for at least 6 years, and therefore every link was covered in old, hard grease, which was quite a job to get rid of. But eventually everything freed up, and you could notice that it was riding smoother after that and steering smoother, at least that's what I think. I changed all the fluids, funny enough that I rolled the 5,000 mile counter in process, so I had to do it anyways. The engine got fresh oil, the transmission got fresh oil, the rear differential, the steering box, and the shock absorbers. I flushed out the rear diff and gearbox with petroleum just to get all the grit and stuff out of there that had accumulated. Especially the oil just looked terrible. So yeah, I'm glad I did that. We took the engine pan off and cleaned that out, and of course had a look underneath and confirmed that the engine was indeed overhauled and in quite good shape. We had a look at the spark plugs to see that it was running fine, showed an even sign of combustion, not too lean, not too rich, no cylinder was missing. Then I took the front wheels off and we re-greased the wheel bearings. While the drums were off, I took the liberty to play with the brakes a little. I installed so-called brake floaters, which is exactly what they do. They allow the brake pads to float a little. They give them a little bit of side play because the pins are shallower than the originals, and that makes them servo brakes is what that's called. So basically, through the rotation of the wheel, the brake pads can get drawn into the brake drum, the contact surface is increased, and the brake force is increased too. The rear brakes already have that. The fronts by design don't, so I figured, well, these pins are 50 euros a pair, and worst thing that could happen is they don't work. But they did indeed work, and by adjusting the brakes so that the front wheels lock up first, I was able to cut down the brake path out of 50 kilometers an hour from, I think, 22 meters down to 16. Think about how many children or how many cars, how much junk can fit in between there that I'm now able to stop in time for. That's not the design that Henry Ford wanted, so maybe some purist is going to tell me otherwise, but I think that by making the front brakes lock up first of all, you decrease the brake path quite a lot, and you don't have the tail sliding out of path. You can see in my first brake test there that I was sliding almost out of control despite counter steering. So it's more controllable now and I think safer. To further improve what little safety there is on this car, I put seat belts into the car properly. Okay. The lights needed attention too. I fitted Bilux in the rears. Which means that I could take off the aftermarket brake lights and include them into the rear light sockets, so that now when I switch the light on and I step on the brakes, the rear lights get brighter, just like with modern cars too. Well, I've done the rears and I didn't really need to, but the fronts needed doing. I was driving at night one time and all of a sudden the lights went off and the fuse blew. And luckily I was still able to drive home with the bright setting, but what had happened is that the contacts in the socket shorted out against each other, and well, the sockets are just poorly designed. They could short out against each other, the points could short out against ground, and the cables weren't properly insulated, so I took them apart, added an extra sheet of Pertinex, ground the contact points a little shallower so that they had more room, and now they cannot swivel that much anymore, and well, hopefully they will stay the way they're supposed to, insulated. I had no keys for the car, so I had to fit a new ignition lock, and while I had the instrument panel off, I also replaced the leaking fuel level meter gasket and lubricated the speedo shaft. Furthermore, the carburetor was leaking, which means two things basically. Number one, the shut-off valve is not sealing off properly, and the float valve in the carburetor itself isn't sealing. So I initially intended to re-lap the cone seat of the shut-off valve. Didn't work. It was just ruined beyond rescue. At some day I might machine myself a new plug, but for now I bought a new one and installed that. I also lapped the seat of the float valve, and I installed new gaskets around the jets, which seems to have cured the issue. Properly adjusting the idle and the mixture dramatically improved my ability to quietly shift this thing. I'm still not perfect, but I'm getting better at it. But you know, if the idle is just too high, then it's pretty impossible to shift into third silently. The motor mounts needed attention to. It has floater motor rubber mounts, and the rubbers were just so hardened up they could be used as hockey pucks. Those were the only parts that I couldn't buy ready in Germany, and since I didn't want to import a $5 item, what I did was I bought vibration dampeners. They had roughly the size I needed, and I trimmed them and cut the hole into them with a sharpened tube in order to bring them to the size I need, and now the engine is a lot more quiet than it was before. The crack in the frame was welded, of course. I did a little rust prophylaxis, and we changed the wobbling rear left rim out for the one on the spare. Now that meant tearing off the old tire off the spare wheel and putting the new one on there, and that was quite a fight. 30-year-old rubber, gosh, never again. Well, we're getting down to little things. I painted the radiator tube black just to match what it would have looked like in the original. Replaced the windshield gasket to keep wind out of the inside, especially now with the winter arriving. I cleaned out the light switch contacts and soldered a hole in the muffler shut. And that's it for now. What still remains to be done is replacing the manifold gasket, as it has just started to develop a leak. I have to make some new bronze fittings to put inside the shock linkages. When I took them apart to re-grease them, I noticed that they are quite worn out. I have to seal the leaking steering box at some time, get the wiper motor running, and replace a spring leaf in the rear. But apart from the manifold gasket, it's really nothing that needs immediate attention. I will be, of course, filming that all, and hey, you can look forward to some content. So, how does the car perform? First off, this car is 90 years old, so anything I say that's good or that is bad about the car, always consider the age of the car. For 90 years old, this car is doing pretty damn well. I have driven a lot newer cars which were a lot more sketchier to keep under control. So, you know, when I say the brakes are good, then I mean for what was available at the time. And if I say something's bad, then do be taking into consideration that technology just wasn't as advanced back then. A definite plus is the parts availability on this car. It is pretty good not to have everything custom made just to fit it. You know, small parts like that can really eat you up in cost, and well, everything that eventually goes broken on these things is available at a very reasonable price. Rear light glasses, 15 euros. Points, 17 euros. Clutch plate, 116. Heck, you can even buy a steering box rebuild kit ready right here in Germany. It can be shipped the next day to you if you want. So it's only large parts like a spring or a fender, stuff like that, that you can't readily buy in Germany. But even they are available. You have to import them from the US, that's all. Then there is the car's reliability. I have yet to have a day where this car refuses to start. I have yet to experience this car dying at a stoplight. It just keeps on running. It is so simple. It doesn't have a fuel pump. It's gravity fed. There's rarely anything that can go wrong. When you should want to buy one of these cars, don't assume that it handling sluggish or it not feeling right is just because it's an old car. Usually these cars are really runners and they are pretty reliable. When you drive these cars, oh my god, you put one hand on the steering wheel and it just goes. Of course, you can make it a bad car by yourself by having the in-cab adjustments wrong, like the mixture setting or the spark advance. But first off, you will notice that. And secondly, it's just a lever and it's just a twisting knob. It's within arm's reach, so it can be done within a matter of seconds. Then there's the feel of the ride. It's not quiet, and some wouldn't call it smooth, but this thing goes through a pothole a lot better than the modern style, sporty suspension cars, which are just on the street like a board. This one is more like a sofa or a ship. It's the right amount of indirectness without feeling uncontrollably or unstably. There's a bit of play in the steering, of course, and when you go through a pothole, then it's going to jolt a little bit, but it's back into track right away, so there's nothing to really worry about. I feel safe when driving this car. Then there's the height of the ride. Because everything sits on top of the chassis, you sit in this thing a bit like in a van maybe, and that gives you just the right amount of height to be able to look above other cars and to be able to judge what is happening in front of you, beyond the car before you, which is a great plus. But it can have its disadvantages. More on that later. The height of the car is also especially handy when you have to reach underneath it, because you don't need a jack. You can just lay on the floor and get below it. It's no problem. You can reach everything lying on the floor. You don't need a jack. You don't need a lift. You don't need a hole in the ground. It's just very easy to work on. All the basic maintenance can be done within your garage. The running boards come in very handy too. While wrenching on it, you can lay all your tools out on the running boards, and while fueling up, you can also put your fuel filler cap there and forget it there. But it's not just handy for stepping onto the car and taking extra passengers. It's a really handy tool rack too. Ergonomics is of course a big topic too. When you see me sitting in this thing, it may look a little bit crammed because I have my legs at an angle, but really it's quite comfortable in there. Everything is nice and tight within reach, and you need those angled legs to have the leverage to, for example, actuate the brakes. Then there's the feel that you get when you're driving this thing. It's not only the view out the front with the massive lights and the hood drooping slightly, but it's also while you're driving. This lever is really something to hang on to, it clacks into position with a very positive action. The steering wheel is, just something to have in your hand. It's hard to describe. It's just feels like a quality piece of machinery that you're operating. Trunk space is phenomenal. At first I was a little sad I didn't have the rumble seat, but seriously, I wouldn't want to sit in that either. The trunk is just perfect. I can fit everything in there. Put your mother-in-law in there too. Some things about this car are so simple, they're ingenious. The windshield here, for example, can tilt, and it does so in 2 notches, fully open, and then there is a notch where it's a little bit open, and some pieces of sheet angle iron placed just in the right spots direct the driving wind downwards at your feet. If you have a leaking manifold gasket, the opening windshield is your friend indeed. Plus it's vertical, so there's rarely any need for the windshield wiper. I mean, it's defective right now, but I've driven this car in the rain multiple times and I really didn't miss it. It's just not necessary. With an old car, you might find that people drive quite up close to you because you may be a little bit slower. No problem with this car because you have a handy curtain in the rear, which you can just pull down, and tailgaters are no more. And last not least, there's the sound of this thing. This chugga-chugga-chug in the idle, and even at higher speeds, it's just uncomparable. There's no car on the road today that sounds anything like this, and it's just wonderful to listen to. I mean, 3.3 liters and almost no compression. That's just got to make for a good sound, doesn't it? We're coming to the bad aspects of the car, and I've decided to list the brakes here. Because most people tend to forget that this car cannot be driven like your modern day car. Things like double clutching, spark advancing, mixture adjustment, just have to be in your head, just like driving a normal car is with brake and gas pedals. It just has to become second nature. And braking early is also one of the things that you must not forget with this car. What I like to say is that the brakes in this car are not bad, but they're not good either. You see, you have 4 brakes all around, and they are very well capable of locking the tires up, but you may take a look at the wheels, they're not really wide, so the contact surface is limited. And that is why you have to keep extra distance, you have to always look ahead of yourself and the car before you to make sure that there is nothing ahead that makes you have to brake instantly, because you can't. You can brake pretty stiff, all right, on a dry surface, no problem. But, you know, it's just better to avoid that situation altogether. The handbrake on this thing, meanwhile, is extreme. You pull 1 click, there's nothing at all. You pull 2 clicks and the rear wheels lock up. It's very hard to control these. So, you know, it's best to only use it when you're at a complete standstill. But when you're parking on a hill, don't worry, the handbrake will keep you there. With these brakes, it's always a good idea to always keep a look around and be aware what is behind you, what's towards the side of you. And, well, that's the next bad point. Traffic surveillance is pretty difficult with this car because you have these massive C-pillars, and the mirrors don't really help you either because they're vibrating and they're not parabolic, so you can only get a very small section of the street. Last thing regarding the brakes is that the main brake arm does not have grease fittings. Everything on this car can be lubricated, but the one thing which is single most important to be going smoothly and not wearing out cannot be greased. Seriously, Ford. I've talked about benefits of riding height. The problem with that is everything appears slower and everything appears farther apart. Combine that with the magic speed of this car being around 60 kilometers an hour, where just everything tends to become smooth, you barely hear the engine, everything's running right, and you're just going way too fast. I've just talked about the brakes, and you know, I'm getting into that comfortable zone myself where I don't look at the speedo anymore and end up going way too fast. You know, that's really a dangerous part of the car. You have to get used to driving at this height, and that takes some time. The praised trunk here has kind of a bad geometry. You see, it has a rack where you can put stuff, and then it droops down and goes another 10 meters or so back. So everything large that you want to mount has to go behind that rack, and you have to lean way into here. So what does that mean? Well, large parts are obviously heavy, and you're going to break your back. I do not want to say anything bad about the transmission. Yes, it is unsynchronized, and yes, it is only 3-speed, but it'll get you around. you get used to shifting an unsynchronized car so quickly, you just have to slow down, relax a little bit. And upshifting with giving gas in between gears, you'll get used to that too. The only thing that you cannot stop with this is an annoying cracking sound when you shift into first gear from a standstill. Everything is turning but the rear wheels, and even if you declutch, then it takes ages for the drivetrain to slow down. When you have all the time in the world, then it's no problem. Press the clutch, wait, and then shift into first slowly. But when you're at a traffic light and there is loads of angry guys behind you, you've got to shift and fast. And well, you can kind of compensate for that by looking at the traffic lights for pedestrians. But you know, oftentimes it's just nasty to shift into first from neutral, unfortunately. Then there's the oil pan design. It would have been such a relief to just have one straight line around the oil pan and put one gasket onto there. This gasket is 4 pieces because there is a U-shaped cutout in the oil pan right where the crankshaft sits. On one side there is a rope which you insert there, and that is where the power takeoff pulley rides in. Remember, it's a rope, and in the rear all it is a razor sharp edge of sheet metal which gets pressed into another U-shaped piece of cork. This makes it impossible to make this car leak-proof. I mean, where's the problem of dropping the geometry of the engine block another 2 centimeters and making the oil pan flat? I just don't... The fuel filler hole is in the center right here, which is a big plus because you don't have to choose whether the gas pump is on the left or on the right. However, it is impossible to get the fuel filler hose into the fuel tank without drooping all over the precious paintwork. What I tend to do is put a piece of cloth around it and guide it with the fueling gun. But you know, it would have been no job at all to put the fuel filler here or there. Then again, it wouldn't have been symmetrical, so yeah, I kind of understand that. Okay, I have flamed about this car quite a long time now. Once again, it's all relative. I could complain about the generator on this thing not being self-adjusting, which means that when you want to drive at night, you have to readjust it so that it doesn't discharge the battery. And when you have to switch the lights back off again, you have to readjust the generator so it doesn't blow your fuse out or cook your battery. But you know, it's still an old car, and that's exactly what it is. So you can't take anything for granted, and for as old as it is so reliable and such a delight to drive. And when I sit at a traffic light, I come to realize I sit inside and command the most beautiful car on the street. So, you know, that makes all of it worth it, and I couldn't be more happy about it. So, that just about concludes everything I can say about this car so far. It's been a brilliant performer. Yes, you have to get your hands dirty every now and then, and yes, you have to pay a little extra attention when driving, and it can't hurt to know a little bit about internal combustion engines and to just look online, you know, how to drive a Model A, something like that, if you're interested in getting one of those. I think when looking for a pre-war car, there really isn't anything better to start with. There are, of course, cars around which are much more sophisticated, especially starting with the V8 in 1932 or the Chevrolet series, but they are much rarer today than this is, just because this is so bulletproof. You know, 4 million were built, a suspected 100,000 are still around, and yeah, do be looking forward to another driving video where I'm not talking. just, you know, sounds of driving. And that's it. Thanks for watching.